Welcome everyone from Canada, the United States, China, and other regions to our webinar. Our discussion today will focus on Canada-US-China relationship in the Arctic. My name is Jia Wang. I'm the interim director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. This event is jointly organized by the Institute for China-America Studies in Washington, D.C. and the China Institute of UA in Edmonton. Please allow me to briefly introduce our two institutes. The China Institute is the only independent, China-focused policy think tank and research center in Canada. We generate and disseminate fact-based knowledge that supports in-depth understanding of today's China and encourages policy development in response to China's evolving role in the world, especially in the diplomatic, economic, and security domains, and those most relevant to Canada. The Institute for China-America Studies is an independent think tank focusing on the evolving dynamics in the US-China relationship. ICAS promotes greater collaboration and mutual understanding through exchanges of ideas, objective policy-oriented research, and assessment of this critical bilateral relationship. Our two institutes have worked together on many events, a research collaboration, and we look forward to much more in the future. Our event today will start by short presentations by our three distinguished panelists, providing US, Chinese, and Canadian perspectives. The presentation will be followed by moderated discussions and Q&A. We encourage our audience members to submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function. We have over 160 registrants today, so we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but we may not be able to cover them all. This event will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to you shortly. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Dr. Nong Hong. She's a friend and a colleague for the past 10 years. Dr. Nong is the executive director of the Institute for China-America Studies, and also a senior research fellow at the China Institute. Her research takes an interdisciplinary approach to examining international relations and international law, with focus on ocean governance in East Asia and the Arctic. And she's also focusing on international dispute settlement and conflict resolution. She has, of course, numerous publications under her belt, and her most recent book, China's Role in the Arctic, Observing and Being Observed, was just published last year. Over to you, Nong.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jia, for your very kind introduction. Good morning to our Canadian American participants, and good evening to our Chinese colleagues and friends, and welcome you all. The Arctic issue, as we know, has attracted a lot of attention these days, and we have been listening to a lot of debates among the 5 littoral states of the Arctic, among the Arctic Council, and also between the Arctic and non-Arctic states. And also the topic varies from security, from economy, to shipping, to climate change, to indigenous people's interests. So today, this 1-hour webinar is a part of a China-US Canada Trilateral Relation Roundtable Series, which is a cooperative program with ICAS and also China Institute at the U of A. Our speakers from the US, from Canada and China will share their views on the respective policy on ocean governance from these 3 countries. They're also going to share with us how they see the trilateral or bilateral interactions among these countries on a variety of issues on cooperation or potential competitions. Let me introduce our 3 distinguished speakers today. So we have Professor Sherry Goodman. She's a senior fellow at Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and the Polar Institute. She has organized and moderated a lot of events at Polar Institute on this topic and have also already spoke in many occasions on these subjects. And our second speaker, Dr. Zhao Long, he's Assistant Director of the Institute for Global Governance Studies at Shanghai Institute for International Studies, one of the leading think tanks in China focused on international studies. They have a group studying Chinese Arctic policy. And our last speaker, Dr. Adam Lejeunesse, he is the Ivering Shipbuilding Chair in Canadian Arctic Marine Security Policy and also Assistant Professor at Bryant Mulroney Institute of Government at St. Francis Xavier University in Canada. He's also co-author of the monograph, which is published in 2018, titled as China's Arctic Ambitions and What It Means for Canada. So I'm going to turn to Professor Goodman now. Would you like to share with us how do you see the US policy on the Arctic, particularly comparing with Biden administration's policy with Obama administration and also Trump administration? How do you see increasing China's participation in Arctic governance in the Arctic? And how do you see for instance, the US-Canada relations on the Arctic issues? I'll turn over to you, Professor Goodman.
Well, thank you very much, Nang, and Zhao Wang. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. I do think it's important to continue to have dialogue among American, Canadian, Chinese, and others, even if our views are not always aligned. But it's important. It's very important for the Arctic region. It's important for our country's global security interests as a whole. So, since I served in the department, since I served in the administration going back into the 1990s, I'm going to start by putting in perspective American Arctic policy, going back to that era, which in 1994, the Clinton administration issued a United States policy on the Arctic and Antarctic regions in a presidential decision directive. And it talked about 6 principal objectives meeting our post-Cold War national security and defense needs, protecting the Arctic environment and conserving its biological resources, assuring that natural resource management and economic development in the region are environmentally sustainable, strengthening institutions for cooperation among the 8 Arctic nations, involving the Arctic's indigenous people in the decisions that affect them, and enhancing scientific monitoring and research into local, regional, and global environmental issues. And those themes have persisted. That is about the time that the Arctic Council itself was created 25 years ago. And I had the privilege of working on some of those issues during that time. Now, in the Bush administration, a more robust Arctic policy was developed. And then in the Obama administration, we find the most recent actually formally issued national strategy for the Arctic region, which was issued in 2013. And it really organized work around 3 lines of effort: advancing US security interests, pursuing responsible Arctic region stewardship, and strengthening international cooperation. And that led to a series of efforts, in some ways culminating in the US chairmanship of the Arctic Council during the period 2015 to 2017, when the activities aligned also with the Obama administration's focus on climate change. And the work of the Arctic Council came to focus, at least the US focus, highlighted the importance of the changing climate in the Arctic. As we all know, it should go without saying that the Arctic and the poles are changing 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. And so the urgency of action in the polar regions, and highlighted but what happens in the polar regions, which of course affects every part of the planet. As we sometimes say in the US, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic and has an impact in the lower 48, but that's true around the world. And so in the 2-year chairmanship of the Arctic Council in 2015, the US focused on black carbon in the Arctic, renewable energy resources, ecosystem-based management practices, and also strengthening commitments to the Alaska Native community. And I think one of the trends I've specifically observed in the 25 plus years I've been working in this area is a continuing integration of indigenous peoples throughout Arctic decision-making. in science and research, from co-production of knowledge to planning and determining the future of a changing Arctic. Now, it won't come as much surprise to most of the listeners that the Trump administration really took a different approach to the Arctic and focused primarily on security issues, which of course were always a part of the other administration's policies, but focused on those exclusively and withdrew from the Paris Agreement, so did not focus on climate change, and was disruptive at an Arctic Council meeting in Rovaniemi, and that was a challenge. Now the current administration, the Biden administration, has of course rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement on day one. And so climate change is front and center in all of this administration's planning and policies. And there have been many executive orders issued, and climate change is an element of every really foreign policy and national security meeting that the president has. And President Xi and President Trudeau and others were involved in the Leaders Summit on Climate on April 22nd on Earth Day. And so there's a real focus and a high priority to climate shaping the future. Now, Secretary Blinken recently attended the Arctic Council Ministerial in Iceland, where the chairmanship transferred from Iceland to Russia. And Secretary Blinken said at that meeting that we're committed to advancing a peaceful Arctic nation where cooperation prevails on climate, environment, science and safety, and sustainable economic development benefits the people of the region. And he listed three priorities: effective governance and the rule of law to ensure that the Arctic remains a region free of conflict where countries act responsibly, to stop COVID-19, secondly, and prepare for future health emergencies, and then the priority of the climate crisis, and putting that front and center, adding even urgency, and then of course protecting the environment overall. He referenced indigenous peoples have generations worth of knowledge and how to be stewards of the Arctic, and integrating them even more fully in a partnership to pursue sustainable economic development and transparency that directly benefits the Arctic people. Now, he recognized that the Arctic has become a region for strategic competition, but it's more than a strategically or economically significant region. It's home to our people. So some specific priorities, the US has put, again, black carbon and methane, reducing emissions of both of those, particularly important. The US has reduced black carbon emissions 34% between 2013 levels, but wants to really focus on this as an Arctic Council priority. And then, so the US committed up to $1 million to support the councils in climate environmental protection work. And also, very importantly, the Arctic Coast Guards of all the 8 Arctic nations have been working cooperatively for a number of years to reduce the risks of oil spills, improve ability to respond to search and rescues. And that Arctic Council, Arctic Coast Guard Forum is very important and continues to be a source of importance there. He also did note that Russia has advanced unlawful maritime claims, particularly its regulation of foreign vessels transiting the Northern Sea route, which are inconsistent with international law. And so that needs to be addressed, and the regulatory scheme that Russia's put forward does not give due regard, as required by international law, to navigation rights and freedoms into the territorial seas and exclusive economic zone. So that's a quick summary, I think, of most recent American Arctic policy in the context of that. Now I want to just take a couple minutes and talk about US-Canada in the Arctic. Of course, Canada is our neighbor, our longtime ally, our biggest trading partner, and we work very cooperatively with Canada in many regards, particularly in the Arctic. We are, of course, we have NORAD, where we protect the North American continent together, and we are staffed together. We conduct activities with the Arctic, with the Canadian US Coast Guards, and other activities, particularly research and development and working together on our indigenous peoples. I think if my time is up, I'll lastly say, Chinese ambitions in the Arctic seem quite significant. And I'm very interested to hear how you think about it. I understand the focus has been on recent research, science, economic opportunities, and foreign direct investment, all of which significantly expand China's influence in the region and the declaration of a polar Silk Road. And I think that China needs to play by the rules of the road as we move forward. And that continues to be a challenge, as we've seen in the overall US-China relationship. So I welcome this dialogue because I do think that it's important to keep talking about how we set the right bounds on that relationship. And I'll look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Goodman. Thank you for helping us understand the Americans' policy on the Arctic. From 1994 until now, we see a lot of common and difference in terms of focus. And now I'd like to turn to Professor Zhao Long, Dr. Zhao Long. China has become such a hot topic, in a lot of events on the Arctic. So would you like to share with us what do you think the most, what motivation that drives China's interest in the Arctic, and how do you see and Chinese engagement with the US and Canada in some of the areas on Arctic governance?
Okay, good morning, everyone. I think it's really a pleasure for me to be part of this great conversation. And thank you, Professor Goodman, for your enlightening opening remark. I think I had the privilege to visit Wilson Center maybe 3 years ago and met with you in person. So it's really great to see you again. And I would like to offer some of my personal observation on Arctic policy or activities as a scholar. And I have been also involved with the kind of a policy drafting process of China's Arctic policy. So I think my idea may be useful for our further discussion. So generally speaking, I think in the era of globalization with a complex and deeply interdependent ecological, economic, environmental process, the Arctic issue has more significant global impact. So under that background, China has more actively participated in the Arctic affairs, I think from the 1990s. So since then, China has exerted more efforts in the exploitation of the Arctic, in expanding the scope of activities and gaining more experiences. So in 2013, China became an accredited observer to Arctic Council, and then in 2018, has delivered the first Arctic policy white paper. So if you can find in that white paper that there's many issues or many topics that China interested in the Arctic, but primarily, as Professor Goodman said, the scientific research and understanding of the Arctic is the #1 topic for China, and also the protection of the Arctic environment. So I think there's some points I would like to address with regard to relations between China and the Arctic. First of all, I don't think it would be fair to describe China's participation to Arctic affairs as a threat, because as you know, China is defining itself as an important stakeholder, and also geographically speaking, a near Arctic state. I think all this kind of self-positioning reflects the fact that China has many interlinks with the changes in the region, starting from the climate system, environment, goes to the, for example, the access to the resources or opening up the new maritime shipping routes. So I think unlike the Arctic states, China has no claims of territorial sovereignty or related sovereign rights in the Arctic. And in practice, you can see China recognized the need of Arctic countries to strengthen their collective identity, and does not seek to become a revisionist of Arctic order. So that's why China insists to cooperate within the current legal and governance framework, such as the Arctic Council and etc. So I think the reason why China emphasizes the role as a stakeholder is because China does not want to be isolated or excluded from that whole process related with the scientific research or economic development in the Arctic. So from my point of view, from my personal view, I think there's 4 dimensions of China's Arctic activities. The very first one, as I said, the scientific dimension. So I think scientific research is a large share of China's engagement in the Arctic. And China uses science to justify its continued involvement in the region. So by the end of last year, China has carried out already 11 scientific expeditions in Arctic Ocean and conducted research for 16 years with the Yellow River Station in Svalbard. The second one, I think, is of course the economic dimension. You can see especially the cooperation between China and Russia in the Russian Arctic. China already become the important explorer for the commercial utilization of the Northern Sea route and the operator of the Arctic LNG transportation, and also important investor to emerging Arctic LNG industry and etc. So from the 2013 to 2019, COSCO Shipping Company from China has completed 31 voyages via Northern Sea route or East Passage. And thirdly, I think the governance dimension also very important to China's Arctic activity. So I think China not just supports the Arctic Council as a platform of dialogue, but also actively involved in the many other dialogue platforms, such as Arctic Territory of Dialogue, the Arctic Circle, Arctic Frontiers, and even established its own platform with the Nordic countries. It's called the China Nordic Arctic Research Center. So I think China view those platforms as the good opportunity for China to learning from the best practices, learning the rule of game in the Arctic affairs, and to observe those current newly developments in the Arctic issue. So the fourth dimension, of course, the bilateral or multilateral cooperation. Beside the Sino-Russian Arctic Sustainable Development Cooperation, we have also very close contact with Iceland on the Arctic Science Observatory. We had signed a joint declaration with Finland of jointly building the Polar Silk Road. Of course, we fully support the initiative from the United States to have the Arctic Science Ministerial. So I think all those, and also more importantly, we had a very good 5+5 model on the Central Arctic fishery agreements. I think all those experiences are very important and much valued in China's Arctic policy. So then I would like to offer some idea about the interactions between China, the US, and Canada, especially after the Arctic Council Ministerial and the declarations on the Arctic cooperation. I think there's some new expectations and also challenges. First, I think for all 3 of us, there's a question that how can we use the climate change topic as the key to restore the consensus of Arctic exceptionalism? I mean, there's a much expectation for Arctic to reprioritize on the climate change, on environment. And many scholars believe that the Biden administration will develop new commitments or implementing new policies on Arctic climate change and the scientific cooperation. But it's worth noting that the security concerns have become more visible in Arctic affairs. In the last 2 years, the US Department of Defense or Coast Guard, Navy, Air Force have developed several Arctic strategy report or outlook, which positioning Russia and China as the long-term threat to US Arctic security and the challengers of the rule-based Arctic order. So there's a question for me that how to overcome, like Professor Goodman also mentioned, the negative impact of the policy heritage from the Trump administration, and to reduce kind of a security tension and ensure that Arctic to remain as an exception area for confrontation. I think it is the main goal for all of us, for all stakeholders. The second question is, how can we mediate the contradiction between Russia's desire of accelerated use of Arctic and some demands of freeze of Arctic resource exploitation? So I think affected by the advancement of a carbon peak and carbon neutrality targets of major economies, Russia's strategic and anxiety of energy development has risen. So it may accelerate Arctic oil gas extraction to reach the capacity peak, I think. But meanwhile, the initiative regarding the strengthening the green standards for Arctic development, implementation more environmental protection rules have been echoed by many Arctic countries and non-Arctic countries, including President Biden, I think, who put a hold on the oil and gas drilling in the Arctic just hours before being inaugurated. So I think the contradiction between the development and protection of the Arctic may be intensified, and this is the topic that we, the China, US, and Canada can be interacted. And the third question is how to formulate a priority list of Arctic cooperation in a post-pandemic era. Because on the one hand, we see the Arctic research faced unprecedented disruptions due to pandemic, and the scientific community finds the Arctic research capabilities severely limited by travel bans. I think this kind of influence is not just a immediate danger for Arctic, but will have lasting effect on the communities of health or food securities, economic issues, and etc. And on the other hand, of course, the sharp decline in consumption, the supply side disruptions, also impacts on the shaping and other the economic use of Arctic. So as a result, the greater uncertainties has occurred regarding the future commercial use of Arctic in general. So how to coordinate our vision, our plans for the future of the Arctic cooperation is important also. Last but not least, I think this is quite important for three of us to think how to reduce the political constraints on Arctic dialogue. Because under Trump administration, I think all established kind of a dialogue or communication channel have been interrupted, have been suspended. So I think at first we should ensure that Arctic cooperation less constrained by the political implications and making the climate change as the leading topic in Arctic affairs. And the Arctic dialogue or cooperation embedded with the consensus of our heads of states on the global climate actions. So because of time limit, I think I will stop here, and I'm really looking forward for your comments or questions. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhao. And I think your talk highlight all the very important key issues in understanding Chinese Arctic policy, mentioned like scientific research as a priority, China's role in international institutions, and also potential challenge intense regarding the power politics in this region. And now I'm going to turn to our last speaker, Dr. Adam Lajeunesse. Canada are one of very important countries among the 5 littoral Arctic states and also among the Arctic Council. So my question to you is, how do you view are there any difference between the US and Canada? Because these countries are 2 very important Arctic states in the North American perspective of the Arctic Council, and how do you see China's engagement, particularly on shipping or investment in this region? to you, Dr.
Well, thank you very much, Nong. Can I just get a thumbs up, make sure you can hear me? Very good. Well, thanks so much for having me. In 10 quick minutes, what I'd like to do is provide an overview of where I see Sino-Canadian relations in the Arctic, the major challenges, sources of friction, the role of the US in that relationship. So I'll focus primarily here on resource development and investment, which is, of course, an area very much in flux right now. Now, this is all a very high-level discussion of Arctic politics at play, but I'd be happy to delve into more details or digress in the question period. So traditionally, Sino-Canadian relations in the Arctic have been framed by what China's Arctic policy would call win-win dynamic. There's been a common approach to Arctic cooperation. Chinese capital and state-owned enterprises with not only a great deal of funds, but a very long investment horizon have been married with premier Canadian resource deposits, which have traditionally gone undeveloped because of the difficulty and long time frames involved in working in the Arctic. Now, Chinese investment in the Arctic has proceeded in parallel with Chinese investment elsewhere in Canada. It's been much slower than investment opportunities in, say, Alberta and the oil sands, but that has never really been a question of politics or geopolitics. It's largely been chalked up, I'd say, to environmental considerations. Working in the Arctic is expensive. It is difficult to move things in and out. The infrastructure is very undeveloped. And so historically, Chinese investments have been very welcomed into the Canadian Arctic, but it has been a very, very slow process, simply because it is a very difficult place to work. What we're seeing now, though, are very significant changes to that underlying understanding and the dynamic of Chinese investment and opportunities in Canada very generally, and the Arctic in particular. Historically, Chinese investment has been very important for Canada, particularly areas like Alberta and the Canadian oil sands. Now, that investment has come in on the basis of a fairly broad geopolitical worldview and an understanding of China as a responsible economic and political partner. Now, Canada and China have had differing worldviews. Many Canadians have disagreed with certain Chinese policies, but that hasn't really mattered. Cooperation was always understood to be the order of the day. And especially from an economic perspective, China has always been seen as a partner, as an avenue for investment, not a competitor, and certainly not an enemy. And so that worldview within Canada has greatly facilitated Chinese investment in the country and in the Arctic. And of course, that's an argument that I make in my 2018 book, China's Arctic Ambitions, where co-authors and I will very clearly state that we think that investment from China can be seen separately from any political conflicts, and it can be managed. In a way, you could say there's a bit of a divide between church and state, if you will, between political conflicts where they may arise and investment opportunities. They can be separate. What we're seeing now, however, is a change in that dynamic. And of course, I use the Hope Bay example, which is really quite illustrative. So if anyone isn't familiar, Hope Bay was a gold mine, which TMAC Resources Canada failed to sell to Shandong Gold Mining Corporation very recently. This is a mine just outside of Cambridge Bay. That deal was subject to a national security review, and the Canadian government, which is ostensibly in favor of foreign investment and in favor of development in the Arctic, came back and said, no, this is a security concern. We cannot have a Chinese company purchase, invest in, and take control of this gold mine. Now, this is a gold mine. This is not a strategic mine. This is not a uranium mine, rare earths. Gold is not a strategic resource. But the Canadian government felt so strongly that it was willing to push that out and to block that merger. So we look at Canadian priorities and where does this fall? So we actually haven't had a really clear statement of Canadian Arctic policy in the last 10 years, but generally speaking, since the 1970s, Canada has had 4 pillars of Arctic policy: environmental preservation, economic development, sovereignty, and support for Indigenous communities. Now, when we look at the Hope Bay deal, this clearly supports both economic development in the region and indigenous communities, because of course many of the employees are local community members, and the bankruptcy of this mine, which was a possibility, would have badly damaged those communities. So accepting Chinese investment would seem to support Canada's long-standing Arctic priorities. Now, the problem here is what we're increasingly seeing are overriding national priorities, taking priority over those Arctic policy pillars. National security and Canada-US considerations are now front and center. Shifts in American perspective, which have already been mentioned, are really quite important in Canada. In a couple of years, the United States has gone from general Arctic apathy to a great concern over great power competition in the North. We've got Mike Pompeo there making a bit of a scene at the Arctic Council meeting in Rovaniemi. You now have the Department of Defense in the US, the Navy, and statements to Congress discussing the possibility of Chinese militarization in the North, Chinese submarine operations in the North. All of a sudden, security is front and center when the North American allies are looking at the Arctic. And while this is American policy and doesn't necessarily reflect Canadian views, it's important to remember that because the two security organizations are so intertwined on so many different things, American policy does influence Canadian perspectives. But what I want to highlight most importantly here is the Arctic isn't exceptional. This changing dynamic that we've seen is a general shift in how Canadians understand China, perceive China, and therefore perceive Chinese investment in the North. It has gone from a time where in 2012, a Chinese company could buy one of Canada's premier oil and gas developers, Nexen, $15 billion, quite a price, to a point where the Canadian government is now denying access to Canadian resources to Chinese investment on security grounds that are sometimes very difficult to see. And if you want to understand why this is happening, where the shift is coming, it's much broader and relates to Canada's general relationship with China. So in the last few years, what we've seen is a big shift in the Canadian government. We have the Trudeau government that comes in with a mandate to expand trade with China. There's an initiative for a free trade agreement, very much looking to strengthen that relationship. And in a few years, that has gone south dramatically. Now, a big part of that is China's broader foreign policy aggression in the South China Sea, constant threats of invading Taiwan, in the seas around Japan, Indian border issues. All of these different things are starting to break down that global partnership understanding and dynamic and transition the relationship to more one of competition. In particular, the arrest of the two Michaels has done serious damage to the Canadian perception of China and Canadian willingness to accept China as a partner in the Arctic. And so the extension of all these global considerations has really impacted how Canadian individual citizens and the Canadian government view and understand China's presence in the Arctic, and in particular, presence and investment in Canada. So unfortunately, what we're seeing is a move from a general understanding of China as a partner, where we can manage disagreements about politics, to one of China as a global competitor, where trade, and this is important, where trade is now connected to great power competition. There used to be, very recently, a point where Canadians could separate concepts or problems around politics from issues of trade and economic cooperation, and the two have been merged together. And of course, it's not hard to understand why they've been merged together. The recent trade war, I wouldn't say trade war, but the trade conflict with China in the aftermath of the arrest of two Michaels, and of course, the problems that the Australian government is now having with certain goods going to China, that has all been very, very telling and influential. In the Arctic, these broader concerns are magnified because it's such a sparsely populated region. So in an area like the Hope Bay mine, you've got something that employs roughly 10% of the population of Cambridge Bay. And so the Canadian government is now seeing a security problem where theoretically a Chinese company might have too much leverage through their operation of a mine in the north. So I'll leave with two potential futures, two different paths we can go. The win-win perspective that used to dominate Canada's relationship with China and hopefully still can again. This will rely on a reduction of great power tensions and a normalization of trade relationships more generally. A long-term understanding in the US and Canada that China doesn't have a security interest in the North will reduce those sorts of fears that Mike Pompeo so dramatically brought to the Arctic Council. And potentially, from an operational perspective, Chinese purchasing of non-controlling states in resource projects, that might be quite a bit more welcome and acceptable to the North American partners. The alternative is growing friction, a continuation of present trends where China finds itself not only locked out of North American Arctic resource projects, but potentially limited in the scientific research it can undertake on North American continental shelves. Transit rights through Canadian waters may, of course, become a political and legal fight if this relationship worsens, and investment may dry up completely. Now, which path we go down very much remains to be seen, but there are very real possibilities that it could be either of the two. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much. It's true that you mentioned that China's investment in Canada actually generate a mix of reactions, some like skepticism, some was like cautiously welcome. So we're looking forward to more discussion on this issue during the Q&A. So now I'm open to the question. Let me pick the first question from the audience. The first one is on the indigenous people's interest. And I think the question, whether it's a top decision-making structure, are the voice of indigenous people really being heard? So I think this question can go to either Professor Goodman or Adam, if you would like to join, because I think the US and Canada, they all have the different policy in terms of regarding indigenous people's interest.
Sure, I'd be happy to start. So the Canadian government has engaged in a bit of a policy experiment over the last 5 years in where the new Arctic policy framework was co-developed with Northern stakeholders, which of course includes Indigenous peoples from across the North. And it's come out with mixed results. The attempt was to truly co-develop the national policy with those Northern stakeholders, which has involved a great deal of conversation, which has involved a lot of compromise, working with Northern people with a genuine attempt to incorporate their views into national policy. So it's been a very valuable experience for Canada, but one of the results has been the difficulty to harmonize all of those Northern voices into Northern policy. Because of course, different Indigenous groups across the Canadian Arctic will have very different perspectives on development and environmentalism and in different elements of a national policy. So the benefit of the Northern Policy Framework Canada has just put out about a year ago is that it really is quite all-inclusive of Northern voices. But the problem is there are so many voices that we have not been able to create a clear policy. And how we resolve that very much remains to be seen.
Thank you, Adam. Sherry, do you want to add, or I'm going to move on to other questions?
Yeah, I think there's a growing trend over time of more inclusion of Indigenous people in Arctic decision-making. I think this is part of a larger growing trend of inclusion, a greater diversity inclusion across many societies. I'm not going to speak for China because that might be the exception, but certainly in Canada and the US and many Western nations, that is the case. And so we see that throughout our societies. Also, the growing importance and voice of the youth. For example, at the Wilson Center last week, we had the first Arctic Youth Summit. And those were voices, many indigenous, but also just many of the under 40, under 35, speaking about Arctic policy, which is something new and notable. And I say the convergence of the trends. I know we have limited time. I would like to ask Long Zhao a question, if I might, because you talked about the contradiction between development and protection in the Arctic, and particularly Russia's continuing desire to exploit its oil and gas resources. I am wondering about your views about China's willingness to reduce or halt investment in Russia's oil and gas development in the Arctic as a way to advance our joint climate change goals and secure greater cooperation and progress on climate change.
Sherry, I think you asked a very question, which I think coincide with two questions posed to Dr. Zhao Long from the audience. So let me try to also rephrase these two questions together with yours. So Dr. Zhao, there's one question, for instance, because you're talking about climate change, would be an opportunity for boosting the U.S.-China relations. So the question from the audience is, in your estimation, how can China work with the US in the Arctic, and what about other Arctic countries like Canada? And then the question on Russia, there is a long list of questions from the audience. Let me just pick the one to go along line with Sherry's question. With the exception of Russia, China's relations with US, Canada, and the Nordic countries have rapidly deteriorate in recent years. How secure does China feel about its growing dependence on Russia in pursuing its Arctic interests? That's the two questions from the audience concerning China's relation with Russia and with other Nordic countries. Dr. Zhao?
Okay, thank you for all the questions. I will try to give you some of my personal observation on that. So first of all, it's about the cooperation with Russia in the Arctic oil gas development or the projects. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of concerns, not just in Russia, but also inside China with regard the future of the commercial use of these oil gas projects, especially the long-term view, because as I mentioned, there already established goal for China to be carbon neutrality or carbon zero emission. So this is a grand strategy for China, and we should, under that big goal, we should reconfigure our, in general, the energy structure starting from the consumption back to the whole import structure. So I think there are existing concerns about the long-term benefit from the China-Russian energy projects in the Arctic, and some Chinese enterprises are, I would say, reluctant to go to Russian far north and to start some infrastructure, especially infrastructure investment, because it takes more longer period of investment and more uncertainties. But in the meantime, I think I think we should improve our the investment standards, and also on the stage of technologies, also the all the critical standards for the operation in the Arctic, in order to secure or protect the environment and to meet the climate change actions or goals. So I think we should find the balance point with that regard, and we are very I think very positive with regard to the cooperation on the climate change in the Arctic. But on the bilateral level, I think currently we are more focused on the LNG projects. instead of oil projects, because the LNG is more, I would say, clean energy product, and more will meet our standard or our goals for the next 10 or 20 years of reconfiguration of our energy structure. So maybe that is very important, that how we can find the balance point to totally freeze those kind of development process, but also not to rush for the, to reach the capacity peak of the oil gas projects. So maybe that will be my answer to Professor Goodman. With regard to climate
you mean
change,
separate, making a distinction between oil and gas investment? Is that?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, and it's reflected on especially on enterprise level, especially when the state-owned company, they are they are more neutral, I would say, with regard to the cooperation with Russia, because their activities or their investment decision will much more closer to our, the general bilateral relations, general policies towards Russia. But private companies, they're more, the benefit driven. They're more, concerning about their own incomes from that projects, especially the long-term period. So I think there's some distinctions between the private and the state-owned company, and between the oil and the LNG projects. Yeah, and to continuing about the climate change agenda between China and the United States, I think, of course, to some extent, the Arctic is so sensitive in a geopolitical level. So it's very difficult to break out from the general framework of bilateral relations. But I think the climate change would be the exception, because both China and the United States, especially the heads of our states, are already made a consensus on the climate actions. So I think the very first step that we should do is to ensure that Arctic research activities are not politically abstracted or influenced, that we can strengthen our cooperation in working groups under the Arctic Council. And I'm quite sure about that at the level of scientists, they are very looking forward on the deepening cooperation on the very different platforms. So I think the Arctic science as a short-term breakthrough for cooperation is something we can estimate it. And it's kind of a knowledge-based cooperation, and seeking for the innovative partnership will be the most prominent agenda for the China and the United States in the Arctic affairs in short term, I think. So we even can, in my opinion, to discovering the possibility of joint Arctic scientific expedition like we did with Russia. But of course, I think there's require a more in-depth discussion. But there will be one of the direction for cooperation, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Zhao. Yeah. Thank you. Here's a question for Adam. I think this audience, she read your book, so she asked a question. Given Canada's official position and indicates that it prefers a regional governance regime dominated by the Arctic states, do you believe there's room for China and other extraterritorial states to play a meaningful role in Arctic governance at present?
Of course. I think the best way to understand Arctic governance is to recognize that there are two distinct areas in the Arctic. Those areas under coastal state sovereignty or jurisdiction, and areas outside coastal state sovereignty and jurisdiction. So within the first area, sovereign jurisdiction, China doesn't have a particular role to play in Arctic governance. That's simply the realities of international law. However, outside of those areas, China certainly does. China, along with every other country with an interest in using the Arctic. So for instance, there will be areas outside of coastal state jurisdiction where fisheries may take place. Shipping through areas outside of coastal state sovereignty is something, this is a right guaranteed to China and all states under existing international law. So whether the coastal states like it or not, China and other states do have a role to play in maintaining Arctic governance. So the recent Treaty on Arctic Fisheries is a good example. Now, this included China simply by virtue of the fact that China is a major fishing state. If China develops a major interest in Arctic shipping, it will by definition play a role in managing a northern shipping governance simply by virtue of its adherence to or lack of adherence to the Polar Code and its willingness to develop with the Arctic states good practices for northern shipping. So this is a conversation that takes place quite a bit. Will Arctic states allow near Arctic states or non-Arctic states to participate in Arctic governance? And really the thing to remember is the Arctic is not just a unique isolated area. The Arctic is governed by global treaties and systems and regulations of which China naturally plays a part in setting and maintaining.
Well, thank you, Adam. So there's so many questions. Let me try to summarize a few. Question for Sherry, in terms of U.S.-China competition in general. So the question, what effect, if any, does the U.S. concern of China in the Arctic contribute to erosion of middle power agency, especially in the case of Canada? I think that's also a question for Adam as well. And then that leads to another question. What are the European countries' role in the development of the Arctic governance? Any comment on Russia's Arctic with possible cooperation with China? I think that's question like concerning about other European countries' role, which are not the Arctic states, but they also have increasing voice in the Arctic Council and the Arctic governance. So Sherry, do you want to? And before I think there's another question for you as well. Do you want to talk a little about what effect or outcome of the 12th ministry meeting of Arctic Council? That's the general question. Sherry.
Well, as to the most recent Arctic Council ministerial, the parties concluded with a joint declaration, which was very welcome by everyone. And, the US was a full participant in that, and the priorities on climate change and preserving the environment and ensuring stability and enhancing cooperation, I think were shared by all. So that's a return to normalcy in some ways to the Arctic Council efforts. And the other Arctic states, particularly the Nordics, have been active participants since the outset. Iceland was very active as a chair on education, ecosystem, climate, the marine environment, and I expect much. The anticipation is that much of that is going to continue even under the Russian chairmanship. It has been a source of stability and cooperation in the region, even as great power competition among Russia, US, and to some extent China has increased in the over the decade. I know we're all almost about time. China-US relations are quite fraught right now, and I thought Adam did a good job of describing the extent to which great power competition and disputes about Chinese aggression in foreign policy and elsewhere has entered the Arctic dialogue. Nonetheless, the US and China and many other countries want to see progress on climate change for the urgency of the planet and for all of our people. And, the two US and China and Canada and many others were together a few weeks ago and have made commitments leading up to COP26. So I do see that that's the greatest opportunity for cooperation. Obviously, each of our countries has made our own national determined commitments to meet net zero by certain dates. The interesting thing about the Arctic, and why I ask Long this question, is, could there be, there's black carbon, that's an area of cooperation to reduce black carbon, but could there be in terms of reducing further exploitation of fossil fuel resources? Oil is obviously a start, LNG maybe comes later. Could that sort of reducing and then eventually eliminating fossil fuel investment across the Arctic region over some period of time would obviously be a benefit, to our long-term climate goals. And so I think that might be the most auspicious way we could jointly think about moving forward.
Well, thank you, Sherry. I think that since we're running out of time, but I'm pretty sure that we haven't addressed quite a lot of very important issues between China, Canada, US, for instance, the legal state of Northwest Passage that Adam mentioned in the last slide of his PowerPoint. So we have been discussing a lot of key issues on China as a non-arctic state's role and how major arctic states like US and Canada view China's increasing presence in this region. So I think looking forward, even Arctic is often described as a region of cooperation, but the opportunities of greater attention may also arise in terms of power politics, competition in this region. So it's worth noting the existing and the potential areas for cooperation, as Sherry just mentioned, that this country, we are just in these three countries, we have already existing experience or potential experience for trilateral or multilateral cooperation in the Arctic governance. So with that, I would like to thank our three speakers for sharing with us so much insightful understanding about the trilateral relations on Arctic governance. And apologize for those audience who raised great and excellent questions, which we are not able to address all of them given the limited time. I'm going to turn over to Jia.
Right. Well, thank you, Nong. That was a fascinating discussion. Thank you all our panelists, Sherry, Long, and Adam, for sharing your insights with us today. I'd also like to thank colleagues at ICAS and also China Institute for organizing this webinar. Finally, a big thanks to all the audience members for attending our event today. Please stay tuned for more events we're planning in the coming month. In fact, in just over 2 weeks on June the 10th, the China Institute will be hosting a webinar with the Art Gallery of Alberta on a slightly different topic, nature and humanity as one, how the Western idea of genius loci intersects with Indigenous and Chinese wisdom and practices relating to landscape. Please go to our website to find out more details. Thank you again and have a beautiful rest of the day. Thank you.